for taking time out of your busy days to busy day to come and meet with us this afternoon. We've got the Nanotechnology Initiative that we'd like to provide you with an update on. I think prior to doing that, though, we'll definitely introduce ourselves. So I'm David Moran, Director General of the Science and Risk Assessment Directorate at Environment Canada. To my left, I've got John Morgan, who's the Director of the New Substances and Control Bureau at Health Canada. To my left, I've got Tracy Williamson, who's the Chief of the Industrial Chemical Branch at OPPT, the Office of Pollution Prevention and Pollution Prevention and Toxics, yes, thank you, at USCPA. And then to my complete left is Brad Fisher, who's Manager of the Nanotechnology Section at Environment Canada. What we'd like to do today is maybe we could start off with a quick roundtable. I also have a colleague here from the Jim Kim from the Office of Management and Budget who's helped us out on this. So maybe we could do a quick roundtable. People could introduce themselves and maybe their affiliation. That would be greatly appreciated. And also, there's a lot of empty spaces in front of us. So if you do want to move forward, that is also an option too. So if we could start off maybe here with the roundtable.
Kaylin Jelinas, Department of State, Office of Multilateral Trade Affairs.
Connor Sloan, Science Policy Intern with ASTM International.
Anthony Quinn, ASTM International Director of Public Affairs and International Trade.
Dennis Prowse, Crop Life Canada.
Robert White, Consumer Health Products Canada.
Jay Sorois, Consumer Healthcare Products Association.
Robert Kiefer, American Chemistry Council.
Warrington Ellicott, Whirlpool Corporation.
Jay West, American Chemistry Council.
Michelle Sullivan, Consultant.
Roberto Barrios, Office of Management and Budget, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
Ken Stretch at the Privy Council Office.
Todd Breeden, Johnson & Johnson in Canada.
Beth Turk, Johnson & Johnson.
Krista Scaldwell, Johnson & Johnson, Canada.
Andrea Peart, Canadian Labour Congress, Congrès du Travail du Canada.
Phil Patzinas, General Motors of Canada Limited.
Mark Nante with the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association.
Julia Reach, the Association of Global Automakers.
Lisa Biddle, Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada.
John Abbott with Syngenta.
Michelle Chaka with Ford Motor Company.
George Cooper with the Council of Great Lakes Industries.
Kathy Landcrone, OSHA.
Maureen Ruskin, OSHA.
Beth Law, Consumer Specialty Products Association.
Jennifer Lawless, U.S. OSHA.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the introductions. Most appreciated. Definitely, there's a lot of new names and faces around the table, in addition to the traditional stakeholders that have been involved in this initiative. I think one of the things that we'd like to recognize is that as people that are new to this process or new to this initiative, if you want to be made aware of any of the ongoing working groups that we have, some of the public comment period that we have on the go for one of our documents, please give us your coordinates and we will definitely follow up with you on that. I think also before starting, we'd like to recognize that while Canada and the US is working on this jointly through Environment Canada, Health Canada, and USCPA, I think this is really a reflection of a lot of the long-standing working relationship that the three groups have had together, working with regards to both the new and existing chemicals program at large over the past many, many years. Looking at this slide here, what you're going to see is largely very similar to some of the other presentations that you saw today. I'll provide you with a bit of context and overview, and followed by that, my colleague from USCPA will speak a bit about some of the progress that's been made to date. Brad will follow up in terms of some of the key issues and linkages to other international work that's being done on the topic. And John, to my right, is here to answer any tough questions that you have. Now, terms of the actual mandate of the group, so what you see here, and maybe I'll just read that out for you, but ultimately the mandate is to share information, develop common approaches on foundational regulatory elements, develop joint initiatives to align regulatory approaches in specific areas such that consistency exists for consumers and industry in Canada and the US. Now, about 12 to 14 months ago, when we sort of saw that and we're trying to figure out what exactly we were going to pull that into, we recognized that it is a very broad statement. And one of the things that we did do was to sort of scope it down, recognizing really what is it that we would be able to realistically achieve over an 18-month period. And in terms of doing that, we focused in on two elements. One is a very broad piece, and that is identifying common principles with regards to the oversight and regulation of nanomaterials. But really what we did was we also focused in much more from what could be done with regards to work under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act as well as the Toxic Substances Control Act in terms of some of the notifications that we may get in on nanomaterials and some of the work that's done with regards to nanomaterials. And I think on that, some of the comments that we've heard from stakeholders that have followed us through this process from beginning to this point in time has been very positive in terms of the feedback that we've been getting and also the engagement. So I would say that one of the successes that has brought us this far is really the active engagement by a lot of the industry and other stakeholders who have a vested interest in this. The other thing also that we're really hoping to achieve out of all of this is an element of greater predictability of decisions. So if we're talking about regulatory decisions, you are talking about an emerging technology, notifications that are starting to come in. And I think one of the questions that stakeholders have is, if we submit it, what is going to be the likely outcome? So what we've been doing is we've been working in terms of a series of technical working groups with industry to get a better appreciation, to develop a better understanding really of the range of uses that could be out there, the different types of nanomaterials, some of the quantities, and a range of other types of information that will ultimately help us inform and identify areas of concern, areas of no concern. So looking a bit into the hazard information too. So what this does between both agencies in Canada and the US is it increases a certain amount of level of comfort and understanding in terms of what exactly some of these categories of concern could be. In turn, what it does is it provides industry and other stakeholders with a certain amount of predictability in terms of what our likely outcomes going to be. The other thing too that I would really like to highlight, and I don't think we could underestimate that, and that is some of the I would call them the side outcomes or the unanticipated outcomes of all of this. And that is, over the past 12 months, both colleagues at EPA, Environment Canada, and Health Canada have worked together very closely in terms of going through this process, getting a better appreciation of how each other would take a look at these nanomaterials, how they would assess them, and also to try to identify common approaches. Now, in doing this, one of the things that we've realized is both countries are involved internationally in some of the work that's being done, for example, at OECD or with other jurisdictions. And what we're able to do with that is to go into those discussions almost with a running start, if you could allow the term. And that is when we get to the table, we're already able to say, here's what we're doing, here's some of the work that's on the go, here's some of the considerations that we've had, and to sort of hopefully push stuff forward from a regulatory perspective, but on a North American basis. So that is actually pretty interesting, something that I would say was a bit unanticipated or unplanned for, but we're definitely noticing it. Going into the next slide, the next two slides are really going to cover a lot of the work plan elements that we've been working on to date. So there's 5 work plan elements. The first one that I'll speak to, and then my colleague Tracy will take over on the others, is the identification of common principles for the regulation of nanomaterials. And the purpose of this is to help ensure a certain amount of consistency for industry and consumers in both countries. And first step in identifying common principles is the US had a series of guiding principles, but what Canada had to do is we had to sit down and develop our own list of guiding principles with regards to the regulation oversight of nanomaterials. And this proved to be a very timely opportunity to do it because within Canada, there are different groups that are looking at nanomaterials. So this provided us with an opportunity to develop a Canadian approach that really looks at what would some of these baseline rules, if you want, almost be. What are the rules for engagement? And we took a look very closely at the US document and took a look at their 10 principles and felt that in many cases, with a few minor adjustments, those principles were very much applicable to the Canadian context. And we're talking about relatively high-level principles that focus in on need for science-based decisions, need for coordinated approaches, in terms of ensuring the balance between precaution and innovation. Another element that definitely is related to that is the flexibility to accommodate new learnings on nanomaterials. So the whole concept of this is an emerging technology, it's something that's new. We definitely have to look out and get an appreciation of what could the implications be, but also not hinder the development of new emerging technologies and also learn and adapt as we move forward as new information becomes available. Now, we finalized our a draft version of our the Canadian guiding principles, and what we're doing now is we have it out for a 60-day public comment period. So that 60-day public comment period comes to an end on July 17th. So if anyone would like a link to that, you'd like to know where those principles are, come see us afterwards. We'll definitely provide you with information on how you could get a copy of those principles. They are available on the Government of Canada website, and I think also a few US organizations have been circulating them. So now if I could turn maybe over to Tracy in terms of some of the next elements.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your attendance here today. And I'm going to take just a quick moment to send regrets on behalf of Jeff Morris. He's on the agenda to be here to talk about EPA's involvement in this project, and unfortunately was pulled away on travel. The next work element that's listed here is priority setting. For this element, we are focusing on identifying common criteria for determining characteristics of industrial nanomaterials of, as David already said, both concern and no concern. Under this initiative, the identification of classes of industrial nanomaterials can be an important first step in making more informed regulatory decisions in both countries' programs. The development of general classes of industrial nanomaterials can, for example, allow for more effective use of existing information on related materials, and also allow for the programs to be more targeted and precise in our requests for information on other specific nanomaterials, again, as we receive reports and notices and review them in our respective programs. This is one area where there is quite a bit of discussion in other international efforts, and so we're certainly looking at the work that's been done in those efforts. Both Canada and the U.S. are involved in many of those efforts. Some are will be mentioned later, but people might be familiar with the work that's being done under the standards groups, the ISO 229 project, maybe also the OECD work. So this is one area where there is some work that's been done, and so we did have a starting collection of information that we began with. The progress to date on this is we have developed a classification scheme based on common characteristics for nanomaterials. So we've developed this again for the purpose of assisting in our regulatory decision making. That scheme is in the annex. We're not going to talk about it in detail here, but we'd be happy to, if there are questions, provide a little bit more information about how we came up with that scheme. The next work element is the risk assessment, risk management element, and this is focusing on sharing of best practices for assessing and managing the risks of industrial nanomaterials. The goal here is to really look at how we can improve consistency and predictability in regulatory decision-making by, for example, identifying consistent and common risk assessments and risk management approaches between Canada and the U.S. In our respective programs. The programs are looking, for example, to identify areas of alignment with risk assessment, risk management that may be able to be achieved without requiring changes to the regulatory framework of each country, because of course that is not the focus here, is to make changes to our framework. We operate within our own programs and the framework that's provided for our respective programs. But things we can do and that we're looking at, for example, is adopting, again, there's consistent approaches. Is there an opportunity to do that in the areas of scientific interpretation? So, for example, how do we utilize physical chemical properties? How is that information interpreted? Also adopting consistent approaches to methods used to identify, for example, exposure and environmental fate, how that information is gathered and used, and how that might then be taken on to inform decision-making for risk assessment and risk management. Additionally, just one other area that's a possibility that we're looking at is how regulatory mandates and uncertainties in risk assessment approaches lead to risk management measures. Progress at this point is we have conducted a comparative analysis on the 2 regulatory programs. And one other thing that we've also completed is a case study, and this was for a carbon nanotube, looking at risk assessment that's been completed to be able to, again, continue to inform our risk assessment, risk management programs in the form of, in particular, best practices. On the next slide, the first work element here is commercial information. This element is focusing on characterization of existing commercial activities, as well as identifying gaps and priorities for future knowledge gathering for industrial nanomaterials. In this area, in order to have more complete and accurate information on the use of industrial nanomaterials would be, we believe, helpful. For example, to inform better exposure scenarios, but also to be able to assist us to target information requests. So it's, again, sort of similar to some of the other activities, but again, here we're focusing on available use information and what we can learn for that to inform our activities. In this area, the progress we've made to date is we've collected information on existing commercial activities, and this is currently, at this time, being shared with stakeholders to identify gaps and priorities. Again, this is another area where there is quite a bit of information available. We certainly started by mining our existing programs, notices that we've already received to date in our respective programs. But certainly there's quite a bit of information available in external sources to EPA and Health and Environment Canada. And then there's a lot of other more open public sources of information. And so we have looked at many of these other sources, especially the external sources as well. The information can get very broad very fast. So again, we are looking to our stakeholders to assist with refining the information that we already have collected, but as well as identifying gaps and priorities that we may have missed. Maybe there's some new areas, new use areas, new applications that we don't have as much information as we might have for others that we've actually seen come through our programs. So some of this information is going to be broader than what's required by our program. So in other words, as David mentioned, this is focusing on SEPA in Canada and TSCA in the US. So some of these applications that may not be subject to SEPA and TSCA, but for the purposes of having that use information, it's still a source of information that can inform our risk assessment and management programs in terms of having a completer understanding and data set of information that can be used for, again, our respective programs. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to talk about the last work element on the slide.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks you all for coming and listening to our presentation. So I think it's, I'm not sure if Dave mentioned it off the top or not, but one of the reasons why the Nanotechnology Initiative or nanotechnology was identified as a work plan area under the RCC was because it was an example of an emerging technology and a technology that really does cut across a wide range of sectors. So what this piece is, so the three middle pieces that Tracy described are very technical in nature, but the first one, the policy principles on this one, are a little bit higher level, and I think this one can be looked at as a bit of a legacy piece moving forward. And the intent of this would be more in looking at developing a framework on how we would treat emerging technologies in the future. So looking at the lessons we're learning from this particular initiative and how it could apply more broadly to emerging technologies moving forward. So this piece is actually being led by our Privy Council office, of course, with input from ourselves as well. But at this point, there's been some draft material that's been developed on this, and I think the hope is that all of these will be wrapped up in November, as we'll be getting to in sort of the next slide in terms of milestones and next steps. I get someone to flip to the next slide for me there. Thank you. So now I'm just going to go briefly over, I guess, sort of the life cycle of this work plan. So as most of you know, in May of 2012, along with many of the other ones, the RCC Joint Nanotechnology Work Plan was published. And then I think for those first sort of 6 months, there was a lot of us coming down to Washington and getting to know our EPA colleagues and really trying to understand the two program areas, how the two programs dealt with industrial nanomaterials under SEPA and under TSCA, how the two new substances programs, what some of the similarities and differences were. So that November 28th, the first major milestone was a fairly successful stakeholder webinar where we had approximately 150 participants, but the focus really was on us to reach out to our stakeholders and let them know what we'd been up to for those first 6 months. So largely information out about the two programs, how many notifications we'd seen in the two countries, and a bit of a very preliminary analysis of the two programs, and we've done a bit more of a detailed analysis since, but that was sort of where we're at in November. And then I think from November to March, we did continue to make considerable progress, and again, coming down, meeting with our EPA colleagues quite regularly to talk about those three work areas in particular that Tracy spoke about. And then March 20th, I think, was a very significant milestone from a stakeholder perspective, because that was really the first real opportunity where our stakeholders had the opportunity to sort of input and shape some of the work we were doing in that individual work plan. So that was we had about 50 participants. The workshop was here in DC, or I guess technically it was in Arlington, Virginia, just over just not too far away. And we really did try and assemble experts in the area in the field. So industry, academia, and also had a fairly significant participation from a number of other departments and agencies from the US and from Canada as well. And that's where we sought input on those three key areas that Tracy talked about. So the idea of coming up with a class approach. So we first put out the classes that are in the appendix to this slide in front of that group and sought their input in terms of how that aligns with domestically and internationally. Also a little bit about what we were doing on risk assessment and risk management and some of the gaps that we had there and how we could potentially get better engagement in filling some of those. And thirdly, not surprisingly, the one that was probably of most interest to a lot of our industry stakeholders was the one around commercial use and getting a better handle on, or really trying to engage our industry stakeholders to help us get a better handle on what the uses really were and what nanomaterials really were in commerce. So I think a very successful workshop. And also, I think, and so we've just recently finalized the workshop report as well, so that could be made available as anybody is interested in seeing that. But also, I think one thing that we recognize, because we are talking about a very technical area with a lot of things that we certainly knew we wouldn't be able to get everything out of our stakeholders in one-day session. So what we did was we set up we strong-armed them into signing up for what we're calling a technical team that's meeting about monthly now via teleconference, where we're furthering the dialogue that we had in March. So March, I think we put some stuff out there, and now we're really starting to develop some of the documents around those three major work elements around the classes and around risk assessment and risk management and around uses. And now we're asking through these regular teleconferences to work with our stakeholders to get to help us fill in some of those blanks. So we've had 3 of those calls so far, with about we're getting about 15 to 20 of our more engaged stakeholders interested in those. So as we move closer to the end of the work plan, which is November, we're hoping to sort of wrap up through those technical team calls to wrap up some of those work plan elements, and we're fairly confident we'll be able to meet all of the deliverables that we had under the work plan that we published in May of 2012. All gearing up for the end of a late fall. So I think tentatively mid-November workshop where we'll be reporting out on all that we've accomplished through with our stakeholders through this short sprint, as Dave likes to call it, of the RCC. So then the next slide. Okay, sorry, I'm just wanted to take a moment just to also to, I think we've already talked quite a bit about the stakeholder engagement, but I think also just that in general, the stakeholders that we have had at the table have helped us tremendously. It's been a very constructive dialogue that we've been able to have, and I think we've certainly appreciated the time they've given, and I think it's been reciprocal as well. Just actually the other day, at our technical team call, it was noted by some of our industry stakeholders that they did find that to be a very useful way to continue to keep engaged, and for us to keep them in the loop on what we were doing. So in general, been fairly positive from our industry stakeholders. And I did just want to touch upon. I'm going to let Tracy speak to the nomenclature one in a moment, but we'll just touch upon. I think this came up this morning, and Dave alluded to it as well. That we obviously the RCC is a Canada-U.S. initiative, but then we also want to keep our views on what's going on internationally as well. So for those of you who are familiar with nanomaterials, you may be familiar with the work being done under the OECD Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials. So that's was established in 2006, and really was to try and pool efforts of member countries to develop occupational better health and safety information around manufactured nanomaterials. And that is recently, there's been a fairly significant milestone there, in that there was a fairly significant research program that was started in 2006 that has just recently come to an end. So we're starting to get that information coming in now, or it's going to be submitted to the member countries now. And one of the things that they are looking at under the OECD is a categories kind of approach, or a classes kind of approach, which is very much consistent with what we're trying to do with the RCC. So this is, as David mentioned, is an example where we in Canada and U.S. can kind of get our position through RCC, get ourselves organized through RCC, and then be able to bring it to the international forum to say this is something that works for our Canadian and U.S. stakeholders. So be a very positive outcome. Again, not necessarily something we'd intended when we started it, but I think a fairly positive outcome on how we've been able to push it further than just Canada and U.S. And now maybe I'll just let Tracy, she's far more familiar with the ISO work, so I'll let her speak to that.
Yeah, and I already mentioned this, but for those that aren't familiar, the ISO TC229 project, it was established in about 2005 to identify and develop standards needs related to nanomaterials, and it does include terminology and nomenclature. There is absolutely a need for work to be done on terminology and nomenclature, not necessarily for all nanomaterials. Of course, nano is very broad, but there are, certainly for industrial chemical applications, there are brand new classes of materials that are nanomaterials that will need nomenclature and terminology development. The work that's happening in nomenclature under TC229, there was a number of initial discussions when the ISO project was first formed. There was a need to sort of put some of that work on hold. A lot of the nomenclature work, of course, needs to follow characterization work, again, especially for new classes of materials. If some of these materials aren't fully characterized, then nomenclature needs to follow that work. And so there's been quite a bit of work done under 229 looking at characterization and also related classification. Recently, there's been a more targeted committee on 229 to go back and focus on now starting to really work on nomenclature issues. There are expert bodies in the world that work on nomenclature, especially when you're talking about more specific terminology and in particular systematic chemical nomenclature. So at this point in time, the committee under the ISO 229 is actually a joint committee with IUPAC. And that is just recently gotten underway and off the ground. So at this point, that committee is going to be steering examples of where there is a current need for nomenclature to be developed for nanomaterials, and if there's enough characterization that's been done on these materials, IUPAC will then assemble the technical experts using their processes to actually conduct that technical work. Again, this is there's existing procedures in place for doing that, and so that's the focus at this time to again to start to have this work developed, but again in cooperation with IUPAC. Nomenclature is mentioned in the broader work plan for nanomaterials. And at this time, our efforts are really going to look to that initial work to be done under this joint committee with ISO and IUPAC. Again, that work should be very efficient and productive following the existing vehicles that are available to do that initial work. So we will, we're not actually, we have not put nomenclature work itself as a work plan, a work element under this project, but we'll be looking at the work that comes out of the, again, this joint ISO IUPAC project, and then go from there and take their efforts and then look at it in the context of our programs and see what the next step will be for us then to address nomenclature.
So I think maybe I'll turn it over to Dave to, or did you want me? Oh, I think I already spoke to OECD.
All right, thank you, Brad. I think the next part, really what we want to do is to really focus in on any questions that you may have, any questions, any points of clarification. I think the other thing too is we'd like to open up the door. I mean, we all heard this morning at the introductory session with regards to planning, if you want, for RCC2. People are looking for other areas, and people with Canada's Privy Council Office, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, definitely looking for other areas where we could have this regulatory cooperation. So I think what we'd be interested in hearing also in terms of additional points of clarification is, do people have any new initiatives or new thoughts or new ideas where ultimately we could have some element of regulatory alignment between Canada and the U.S. in the chemical sector? So definitely don't want to put anyone on the spot this afternoon. I recognize that we're pushing to 6 o'clock, but we do have that summer dialogue that's open, and I think the purpose of that is to really foster that dialogue, engage in some of those discussions, to identify if there are any areas. But I think it's not just identifying any areas. I think, like I mentioned at the outset, the success that we saw with regards to nanomaterials was really the engagement by everyone involved. So very active engagement by a lot of the stakeholders. And I think that is one thing that has really brought us this far. I think the other thing also was the ability to bite off something that was probably manageable and doable within the time frame. So like I mentioned at the outset, we could have focused in on nanomaterials at large, and there's a range of different groups that regulatory groups within both governments that deal with nanomaterials. But we really targeted it down to something that we said, from a something that be covered with regards to industrial nanomaterials as it relates to activities under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Toxic Substances Control Act. So that really gave us something that we could zoom in on, we could focus in on, and really result in tangible deliverables. So any thoughts on that, either today or as part of that summer dialogue, would be most appreciated. Last thing, I would really like to thank everyone for your participation this afternoon. It is most appreciated.
So I have a question for David Marin. So I appreciate the collaboration between Health Canada and Environment Canada, but it seems like there's a lot of occupational health and safety implications as well. So I'm curious to know if you've been in contact with HRSDC Labour Program or with the WMIS Current Issues Committee within the structure of Health Canada.
First one I'm not familiar with, but for the second one, yes, we do have ongoing discussions with the WMIS office within Health Canada, and there is also a federal provincial working group, that we are also involved in, and that we provide information through that committee.
So the reason I'm asking is, I think this is a positive initiative, but right now, HRSDC Labour Program, under the ongoing regulatory review of Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code, is reviewing Part 10 on hazardous materials, and right now they're drafting nanotechnology regulations, and it is deeply, deeply disconcerting to me that these two things would happen in parallel with no communication either way. I had to tell them about this initiative, and I'm embarrassed to say it in front of our American friends and neighbors, but it doesn't look very good. So maybe there could be some communication between you just to ensure that we don't have two sets of regulations and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. But I'm also aware that FETCO has been very involved in this, as a federal association of federal employers. Mm-hmm. They didn't know about it either. So I recognize that. I know how it works Environment Canada and Health Canada when it comes to chemical products, but I think it's important to recognize the links to occupational health and safety and just make sure things dovetail together a little bit better.
Thank you very much for the comments. Any other questions or points of clarification? Last chance. Well, late in the day, definitely recognize that. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today, and have a safe return home. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.